keep on running. I keep on running. I keep on running. Running. Non-stop till they out of breath. Putting in about 1,000 reps. Addicted to the grind like a pound of meth. Tonight I rock a lot of how I clown the best.
Welcome to the Football Camino. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today, wherever in the world you are listening. The Football Camino is dedicated to taking you on a football journey with football's most interesting players, coaches, trainers, club personnel, and journalists. Think of these as mini autobiographies. Each guest will show you how they got where they are now, reveal their techniques for success, and what they've learned along the way. Our guest today is journalist and author James Montague. Montague has written 3 books and 1 ebook, including When Friday Comes, Football in the War Zone, the revision of that book, When Friday Comes, Football, War, and Revolution in the Middle East, Ultras, How Egypt's Football Fans Toppled the Dictator, and 31-0, On the Road with Football's Outsiders, which won him Best Football Book at the 2015 British Sports Book of the Year Awards. His new book, The Billionaires Club, The Unstoppable Rise of Football's Super Rich Owners, comes out this August. He regularly writes for GQ, Bleacher Report, CNN, World Soccer, The New York Times, and appears on the BBC World Service's World Football Show. Even if you didn't listen to part 1 of our 2-part interview, that's fine. You can listen to this episode on its own. In this episode, he talks about what didn't make it into his new book, traveling to the migrant workers camps in Qatar, what surprised him while writing the book, his fears for the future of football, and what story he's most proud of writing. About 15 minutes before the end of our interview, our phone call was disconnected, so I apologize for the break in conversation. Without further ado, sit back and enjoy part 2 of my conversation with James Montague. So I want to transition a little bit to your new book, The Billionaires Club, The Unstoppable Rise of Football Super Rich Owners. You kind of mentioned a little bit about what the book is about. But before we even get into what the book is about, how do you know where to start a book? In the last book, 31-0, you start the whole book with an introduction to J. Lee Hodgson and his personal journey.
Yeah.
How do you know where to start a book or where to start a long form feature for that matter?
Well, usually it's setting a scene that's not directly at the beginning of the story, but somehow encapsulates something about it. So that it's not linear, but it's a good place to start. I mean, with 31-0, for instance, I thought it was going to be absolutely linear because you start with the first game and then you move chronologically through everything. The problem was that the first game that I was going to cover was supposed to be the first game of qualification for 2014 World Cup, which was Palestine versus Afghanistan in Tajikistan. It was about 2 months before that they then suddenly moved the game with Montserrat and Belize. They moved it forward 2 months. So suddenly that was the first game of the World Cup qualifiers. I thought, fuck, I've just organised this incredible trip. And so what do I do? So I was thinking, and I saw J. Lee Hodgson scored. I looked into it, found out who he was, and he played in all these non-league teams. And I thought, do you know what would be more interesting would be to go, the first chapter will be Palestine, but I'll go and find Jace playing in the league somewhere in Nottingham and asking about his experience of playing in a World Cup qualifier and getting knocked out. So I can tell the story of that first game through him, but in England, and in speaking to him, and how much it meant to play in the World Cup and how important international football was for him and what an opportunity it was. And it was a great underdog story as well because Montserrat are one of the worst teams in the world. Then suddenly, by going to this football field in Nottingham, on the outskirts of Nottingham, that was the opening for me. And with the Billionaires Club, it took a little bit more time to work out where the beginning was. But, I knew that it was going to be a kind of journey through first kind of Eastern Europe. Not really a journey through Eastern Europe, but covering Eastern Europe. And then the US, and then Asia, and then the Middle East. But when I went to Crewe one time to see Northern Ireland play Qatar in a World Cup qualifier, which is not World Cup qualifier, so it was a friendly, but it was utterly bizarre that you had Qatar, this team and country and football system that kind of represents everything that a lot of people are unhappy about in modern football, super rich, money, kind of unearned kind of respect. They were at this extremely old, working class football, like almost like football of a bygone age. And the clash of those two in that same place at the same time, that was, for me, that encapsulated something of what the book is about. This clash between football as a working class sport, deeply wedded into its community, kind of effectively owned by the fans, even if it essentially isn't owned by the fans, but I mean, beholden to the fans, usually owned by businessmen who, you know, do it out of a kind of sense of philanthropy rather than profit, because there's no real profit in football, certainly not at that level. Then clashing with Qatar, who are there in this kind of luxury bus, you know, that nobody knew anything about them, playing on this. To me, that clash was the essence of what the book was about. So I decided to start it there. But usually it emerges later on, where I think in hindsight it should be. So I kind of have an idea of the kind of journey that I'm going to take and find out stuff. And somewhere along those lines, a story will emerge that I think encapsulates it, you know, in a non-linear way. And then I put that at the beginning.
How was the writing or the planning or the reporting process for this book different from your ones in the past?
Well, I had a child in the middle of it, so that put the kibosh on a lot of it in the beginning, you know. And that was the thing that I had to really plan around, because it was very difficult for me to leave and travel when my partner was pregnant, and then we had the baby, and then what we actually ended up doing was when she was a couple of months old, my girlfriend and my baby actually travelled with me for most of the places we went to. So we went to Thailand together, then Malaysia. Then I had to go to China to obviously research everything that's happening with Chinese football and the money from China. And then I went off to Bangladesh, which is another story altogether. So that was the hardest thing. You know, that was the real difference this time, was that I had to kind of plan it around something that I'd never had to plan it around before, which is, you know, a little humanoid that you know, that has to come first. But yeah, it was great. She travelled with us everywhere. I mean, I would heartily recommend, if anybody else ever gets stuck in this situation, put in this situation, or put themselves in this situation, I should say, is babies travel really good up to about, you know, a year. You can go anywhere with them. You know, you can take them on 14-hour flights.
Really? Because
when they get,
I always hate, honestly, you know, when I'm in a flight with a, you know, baby in the row next to me or on my row, because they're always like crying, and I'm, you know, like, oh, drop me out, like.
Yeah, you know, I mean, maybe we were lucky because, I mean, both me and my partner, we travel, you know, that's what we do, and I guess there's going to be something of us in her. But she's a great traveller. So she's got more stamps in her passport at 18 months, and I think my mum, dad, and my sister have collectively in their entire lives. You know, so that was the big thing. You know, with this book was that, but what I haven't had before the book is something that is necessarily like a hot topic issue that emerges, like, as you're writing it. Like the first book, I mean, nobody'd written anything about Middle Eastern football really, so, you know, it was kind of like the first kind of way of looking at the region like that. So there wasn't really anything to compare it to. And 31-0 had its own logic, because it's essentially covering a qualification campaign. So it has, you know, you have to be there at these dates doing these things. With this, I started off with an idea to write about the super rich, and not from the angle of speaking to them, because you're never going to get anywhere near them, but how did they make their money and go back to their home countries? Who are the people that have lost out? Because a lot of these people who have made money and now investing it in football haven't done it in a particularly ethical way, or in a particularly legal way in many cases, and they're certainly not in it for the money if you look at the Abramoviches and the Usmanovs of this world. You know, I I had a plan of people that I wanted to speak to, and then suddenly in the middle of it, China blows up. Suddenly you have all this money. You have President Xi Jinping coming in with this plan for football, and suddenly you have toy car manufacturers buying Espanyol in Spain, and you have LED light manufacturers buying Sochaux in France. You have a guy who's got a sports marketing company in Beijing who buys Ardo Den Haag, and the story of Chinese ownership is kind of told through the lens of Ardo Den Haag, who I was living in Holland at the time. So I spent a lot of time with this kind of extremely working class fan base, known for having the worst football hooligans in the world. And following that story of how it was bought by Chinese money and how it's all basically fallen apart, and the warning that's going to send to everybody about Chinese investment in football. So it was completely every day I'd open the papers and there'd be another team that's been bought by a Chinese club. There'd be a second division, Belgian club bought by effectively a state-owned Qatari institution, or there'd be a filter club that's been bought by the City Football Group that are building this kind of network of clubs around the world, which is the next big ethical issue that football's going to face, is that you've got these kind of conglomerates of football clubs around the world and can bypass all sorts of local kind of legislation. So it constantly changes. And even now, I've put the book to bed. It's now going to go to the printers. It's been legaled. But, you've got this Qatar suddenly being isolated by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is an issue which I've kind of dealt with in the end of the book because, I spend a lot of time in the United Arab Emirates. You talk to, people about Sheikh Mansour and the fact that he is a high-ranking political official within that government and within that royal family. And, that is a place that is one of the worst human rights abusing regimes in the world that has a problem with human slavery. And nobody talks about it. No one talks about that with Manchester City. You talk about it with Qatar, but not Manchester City. So I talk about why that happens a little bit. So it's a constant change. I hope it hasn't ended up with a dog's dinner of a book off the end of it. It might have done. I've got no idea. I'm too close to it to know if it's terrible or not. But it was constantly changing, and I had to constantly change the focus and the stories and adding things. And it was actually a very difficult book to write. And I just hope I've done the topic justice and the people I've spoken to.
You mentioned that, even since, and the book you finished writing it, I think last year, right? And it's been in the legal process, getting it, permitted essentially this year. You've even said, obviously, just this past week with the Qatar getting isolated.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the book that, even now that it's been a little bit time since you've written it, that you wish you could have delved into more, or something that got cut that you wish that didn't?
Yeah, I think in hindsight, what I tried to do is focus in on each section on one or two stories of people who had lost. The original, when I first wrote the pitch for Billionaires Club, the original quote I had was, "Behind every fortune there is a crime," which is a Balzac quote. But then when I looked into it, it's not actually the quote. It turns out that this was the opening quote, which is the bastardized version of what Balzac said, used by the guy who wrote Godfather. So it's actually the epigraph for Godfather. So I couldn't use it in the end because it would cost tens of thousands of pounds to to get it used. So I tried to think, okay, well, what is the crime in the root of this? What is the original sin when it comes to this fortune? And so with the section on Russia, I concentrated on a guy called Vladimir Sherkov, who is an activist, anti-corruption activist, who's basically number two to Alexei Navalny, who's now incredibly famous around the world for being the only political opposition that's really been tolerated by Putin in Russia, and how this guy was essentially threatened and then put in exile into London for doing his work, and how people like Usmanov and Abramovich have been kind of essential in creating a system in Russia so that they can keep their wealth that destroys civil society. Now, one of the things I really wish I'd done more of was I went to Ukraine to do more work in Russia, but they didn't have the time, and it was very difficult to find how I could have added to what Vladimir told me and the research I did in London in particular, because it was interesting that London was the place to go if you wanted to speak to dissidents, Russian dissidents, the same city that many of these Russian oligarchs that are connected to Putin live. But I wish I'd done more in Russia. Everything else I'm pretty satisfied with. I suppose the one issue is that because I look at books in very international. I don't often think of a British audience. I think of writing about interesting things and hoping that somebody finds it interesting, whether it's in America or Asia or wherever. And I really thinking about like what's happened with a lot of lower division clubs, like at Nottingham Forest, at Charlton, especially at Blackburn. I wish I'd gone to India to do something more on Venky's. I mean, I write about Venky's, but I think it would have been great going to one of their factories. I mean, there's a couple of other ideas that I'd had, like I'd actually like to focus more on British billionaires. I mean, their stories are spread throughout the book, but a special section on them, especially Mike Ashley. I had a plan of going and working in a Sports Direct, and on a 0 hours contract, and obviously being treated like shit. But then the Guardian did an investigation on it, which blew the whole thing open. So there were lots of things I would have done differently. But I mean, I think that's the same with every book. I mean, when I was doing 31-0, I was kicking myself. I really wanted to do a story about Venezuela, which I didn't get around to doing. It was very difficult to do that. There are other stories that I wish that I could have done. But in hindsight, it turned out okay. So I hope this one's going to turn out okay. But I'm in that period at the moment of complete terror of not knowing whether it's any good or not, and it might get ripped to pieces. And I suspect it probably might do, because a lot of fans, I think, who are very tribal by nature, are going to be quite unhappy about the things that I've written about their owners, because I mean, especially Manchester City, who the club's been transformed. I mean, the area around the stadium and that part of Manchester has been transformed by this money. But there are very difficult questions to be asked about where that money has come from, who the people involved, not just the owner, but other people involved at Manchester City Football Club, who are involved in some morally reprehensible behaviour, and part of a system that I think is morally reprehensible back in the United Arab Emirates, that is ruining the lives of millions and millions of people.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I mean, you just read some of the stuff. I mean, obviously, I'm looking forward to reading your book, but you just read some of the human rights abuses taking place in those countries, and it really, I mean, it not just shocks you, but it hurts to just read.
It's disgraceful. I mean, one of the things I knew, I mean, I had the idea for Billionaires Club in 2008, actually, when Friday Comes came out. It came out about 2 weeks later. Sheikh Mansour buys Manchester City, and of course, I knew about the Abu Dhabi royal family, the differences between the Dubai royal family, because the United Arab Emirates is 7 emirates. And they each have their own political systems and their own diplomatic connections with other parts of the world, and I knew a bit about what the reality of life was like there for people who weren't rich Westerners or wealthy Gulf Arabs, which was essentially a kind of a crushing form of slavery, whether men or women. I mean, the treatment of female migrant workers is almost much worse, because, I mean, there's a sexual element to that, so much so that a lot of countries have stopped allowing women to be brought in as maids in Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, other places like that. So, I kind of knew it. And then when he bought it, I thought, this is what I should write about, like what the truth is of all this money. But it got no traction. And thank God I did hold off on it, because the story's become much more vivid and much more interesting as it's progressed. I mean, I suspect if you wrote this book in 5 years' time, it'd be even more interesting. But I hope it kind of captures a kind of time and a moment and an issue that often isn't taken seriously in football, which is, does it matter where the money comes for your football team? Does that matter? I try to say it does, but the depressing thing I discovered when researching the book, that most times it doesn't matter, but it should.
Yeah. I know that going into the book, you knew that it was going to be almost impossible to talk to these owners, these billionaires.
Yeah.
But even though you didn't get to really talk to them, what did you learn about billionaires in general? Obviously, it's hard to, you don't want to make too many blanket statements, but what did you learn about billionaires in general through examining these owners?
That largely they're completely disconnected from reality. And I think this is an issue with wealth. I think the wealthier you become, the more you're inoculated to the real world. And what I found is actually there are huge geographical differences. And part of why billionaires invest in football are very different. Something that you all know very well is from North America. Why do people invest in sport? There is definitely a profit motive there. And the people who are investing in soccer in England and in Europe see a system that they've created. They're usually guys who have owned NBA clubs or NFL teams, franchises, and know that there is, with this amount of money that's gone in, that if you can rationalise the business, there's huge profits to be made. So this is why you've got Kroenke coming in at Arsenal, is he's worked out with the Rams and all these other kind of coterie of now that his son has been spun off to his son so that he could own the Rams outright, that there is money to be made. Whereas in the Middle East, it's about soft power, nation building. Profit doesn't make any difference. These are the richest people on earth. These are trillionaires, let alone billionaires. So the differences are pronounced between regions and why they're investing. But when you get down to brass tacks, they're all the same class of people. They buy property in the same cities. They use the same lawyers. They go to the same places on holiday, and their geographical differences don't make any difference anymore. These people do not have nationality. They have wealth, and that wealth puts them into a different class, separate from everyone else. And they're inoculated from reality, and they often make very good business decisions, but bad decisions as human beings because of that. And it's scary because the inequality, one of the things I wanted to try to bring out with this book was that this isn't just about how football is changing because the super rich being involved. It's how the world is. It's how wealth and extreme forms of wealth are really subverting almost every institution, democratic, social, economic, and cultural. We see that in the art world about what's happening with the Guggenheim being built and the NYU campus being built in Abu Dhabi and Qatar and the Louvre, how it's being taken by this extreme wealth and put somewhere else, away from public view, the privatization of almost everything in the world. All of these things I wanted to try to explain somehow through football about how the world is I think, going in a pretty bad direction. And, that was what I discovered about. But I did actually get to speak to one billionaire who is just a billionaire still, Thaksin Shinawatra, who's the former Thai Prime Minister and former owner of Manchester City. He actually agreed to speak to me. And that was a fascinating conversation, sitting down with him in his kind of hotel suite in Paris, where he very much views himself still as a statesman, deposed, who will go back one day to Thailand. And but again, it was the only reason that he spoke to me because it was in his interest to speak to me, because he is a guy who still wants a political comeback of some kind in Thailand, and obviously you have a military junta in charge there. His sister was deposed too, so I did actually get to speak to one, and speaking to him about it, there is some. I'm still not entirely sure why he bought Manchester City. I think it largely was a diversionary tactic, away from his troubles. And equally, football, I think he learned very early, was an extremely good way of also diverting problems internally away from what was going on politically and building popularity. But it all fell to pieces when he tried to buy Liverpool and suggested a lottery to pay for the purchase of Liverpool, which would effectively be transferring money from some of the poorest people in the world to some of the richest. So I did get to speak to one billionaire, although I think he's a dollar billionaire, not a pound billionaire.
Oh, okay.
But the exchange rate now is like God knows.
Yeah, no, I mean, is he really a billionaire? I mean, no.
Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of bullshit about that as well. I mean, about wealth, and you go on. I mean, there's no way Stan Kroenke would speak to me. He declined to speak to me, and who knows what their real worth is? Because I mean, Forbes. I mean, I do quote Forbes quite a lot in it, but I mean, I think the provenance of their figures is a lot of guesswork.
Well, I mean, all of in the last podcast I had on Kieran Maguire, who is a professor at the University of Liverpool, and he does football finance. And we were talking about how many different models there were to calculate wealth, and there's just so many different ways to calculate how wealthy a company is, or an organization is, and in this case, a person. Is there anything that was shocking or surprising that you learned writing this book?
I mean, everything really. I mean, the reason I went to Bangladesh, not because there's a lot of Bangladeshi money in European football, there isn't, but it was tracking the system of kafala, which is the bedrock of the economies of the UAE and Qatar. And that's something that's come out because of the World Cup in 2022 and people looking suddenly very interested in the fact that, there is essentially a slave class that builds the buildings and the stadiums at the 2022 World Cup. And what I wanted to do was try to connect, because when you often talk to people about the owners of clubs from Qatar or from Manchester City or from any money from the UAE, it's like, this is money in a private capacity, disconnected from everything else. If you understand Middle Eastern society, there is no such thing really as private money. It is all patronage that comes from oil and gas and is distributed hierarchically down to how close you are to the emir or to the sheikh. I mean, this is what it is. You cannot separate the money from where it came from. Now, those economies are basically, in those cities, are built by this form of kafala. So what I wanted to discover was, go from the start, from the root cause, from why these guys are leaving their villages, following them all the way to these camps in the UAE and eventually to the World Cup stadiums in Qatar. And that was absolutely shocking. I've been to the camps before, but seeing the poverty in Bangladesh, Bangladesh is it's on the verge of being there's bad things are going to happen in Bangladesh, I feel, because there's a growing Islamic kind of extremism there. That is, it's this huge, unwieldy, massive, overpopulated. I mean, Dakar doesn't really work as a city. You can't really get anywhere. It's heavily polluted. Very damaging political culture there. And, finding out how much an entire country is completely dependent on the exploitation of these men and women in these labor camps in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi. That was shocking. And then seeing their conditions in Bangladesh, going to the airport and meeting guys who were on their way to Qatar to work on World Cup projects, who were illiterate, and handing me pieces of paper to fill out their departure cards and asked to look at their passports. And they were all on 1 month work visas to work on projects in Doha. Just this form of exploitation is so, it's the issue that nobody wants to talk about. I mean, they talk about kafala and Qatar, but that is just a tip of the iceberg. Why nobody's talking about this for the whole Gulf, and especially with Manchester City and especially with the UAE government is and then eventually I get into the camps in Qatar, and for all the talk of reform that's going on there, which is admirable because it's not happening in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, I have to sneak into some one camp in Sharjah, which is in the centre where like tens of thousands of people. It's like this city, and you have to break in because you can't. The security guards won't let you in. They're on the lookout for you. And there was a water truck that was passing. I remember me and a photographer kind of sneaking behind the water truck, like running in the darkness to get in. And then getting into the camps, and you're seeing kind of sewage flowing freely, like on the floor. got kind of men living 10 to a room in these tiny, filthy rooms. All of them they were there promised a certain wage, not getting a certain wage. They're working in 50-degree heat. I mean, it's just a miserable, horrible existence. And these guys are kind of in tears telling you their story. You know, and you know, these guys are the guys who have lost. These people, their stories, and their loss is what, you know, modern football is effectively built on. Whether it's World Cups, whether it's football clubs like PSG, whether it's Man City, that money that's being spent on these big money players, the bedrock of that, of those economies that produce that money, is oil and basically bonded labour. And that was what shocked me. I knew some of the stories. I'd been to camps before, but seeing the entire exploitation of these men and women, you know, and the people taking their cut and who's profiting off these guys and women's broken lives, it was sickening to see. And I just hope I've done their story justice. I mean, also there is another issue as well. Is that if it does sound kind of far from football, I guess it was. There were periods of months where I didn't see a football game traveling between countries, and I guess part of it does veer quite away from football. I'm almost kind of reticent to call it a football book anymore, but the connection, I think, between, you know, a football club and the money in that football club and a village in Bangladesh where, you know, men are forced to leave because there's no other opportunity for them, and the people that exploit them on every step of the way. I think there is a thread that connects all of those, and trying to follow that thread for me was the most shocking part of researching the book.
Yeah, I mean, the two are linked, and they can't be separated. And hopefully, we'll see what type of awareness your book, you know, brings about. And I know just recently I read an article about it's not just the 2022 World Cup, it's the Russia World Cup next year. Yeah,
with the North Korea. I mean, Josimar did a great. I mean, Josimar's great magazine, Norwegian magazine. It's in Norwegian, so it's very rare that you get them to publish a translated article. But yeah, they've done some great work on the North Korean slave labour at the Russia World Cup. I mean, the issue of Russia in 2018 is another one that, again, morally is absolutely reprehensible to have a World Cup held in that country, given the situation that activists face there, the destruction of civil society, which many football club owners in Britain are absolutely complicit in, and which is, again, you know, this is the Abramoviches and the Usmanovs of this world are involved in changing Russian society to the point where it's barely recognizable as democracy anymore.
I'm curious because I heard you on a previous podcast or on a different podcast, and you mentioned the ghost owners when you went to Portsmouth and hearing about the ghost owners as it changed hands a couple times. Can you just share the story of that? And then I have a follow-up question to go with it.
Well, this is the big rewrite I had to do, was because all the way through the book I talk about, you know, these men, and it is all men, you know, buying these football clubs and effectively fucking them up in some way, whether actually ruining the club financially or destroying the culture of the club, or in other ways somehow, you know, being generally a bad thing for football. And then Portsmouth was this story. This isn't like my epilogue, you know, this is the end of the book where I do this long thing about Portsmouth essentially was destroyed by a series of terrible owners who all passed this. We have this thing, this fit and proper persons test, although it's not actually called that. But basically, owners and directors have to prove that they are fit and proper, usually by showing that they've not been convicted of a criminal offence or anything to do with an offence to do with money, basically. And so Portsmouth was owned by Sasha Gaidamak, who, if anybody who follows Israeli football will know, is the son of Arkady Gaidamak, the former owner of Beitar Jerusalem, was wanted on a gun-running charge for his days when he was an oil trader in Angola. And he's currently on house arrest. He's in prison, actually, in France very recently. But all sorts of issues about where Sasha Gaidamak's money came from. Was it from his dad? He proved that it wasn't from his dad, although later it turned out it might have been from his dad, which contravenes all sorts of UEFA rules. He bankrolled Portsmouth FC into the Premier League and then to win the FA Cup, which for many Portsmouth fans is this incredible story. But then the financial crisis hit. He sells it to this series of buyers. One of them being Suleiman Al Fahim, who's the Emirati who got very famous around the world for being the face of the Manchester City purchase. When Sheikh Mansour bought it, you know, he was the face, this big guy with a beard, and he's got this kandora, the Arab dress, and he's like, yes, we're going to sell, we're going to sign Messi and Ronaldo, and all these kind of like. Eventually, they got rid of him because he was too loudmouth. Quite a nice guy when I met him. I mean, I actually kind of was introduced to him and interviewed him a couple of times. And he tried to buy Portsmouth, but it turned out that he didn't really have any money. He was just a broker, really. And then he had to sell it after 40 days. And there's a series of, one of them was a guy who was owned a Russian guy who owned a bank in Lithuania, but was wanted for embezzlement, and was then the British courts were about to extradite him to Lithuania, and then he disappeared and turned up in Moscow, where he will never be extradited. And there's one guy called Ali Al-Faraj, who's nominally some form of Saudi investor with links to the royal family, but they never saw him. They never met him. All they saw was a grainy passport picture, and he was able to purchase the club and became the owner briefly, even though not a single person of the club even believed that he existed. So they had no idea whether this guy existed. Still, they don't know if he existed. I mean, nobody's spoken to him. His brother gave a couple of interviews, but no one knows whether Ali Al-Faraj actually existed. And eventually, the club was almost brought to, I think there was 5 owners in 4 seasons or something crazy like that, and almost brought to its knees. It was effectively in the 4th division, so it had like 4 relegations, and he got down there, and eventually it was saved by the fans who bought the club as a supporters trust, and a few connected, wealthy Portsmouth fans as well became shareholders. But effectively, the club was owned by the fans, and it was saved. And I went there to do this story about how the club was saved by the fans. The fans had come together, they cleared the debt. They'd taken control, and they thought, it doesn't matter, we're not going to aim for the stars anymore, maybe the championship, but this model can work, and it's great, and fan ownership is brilliant. And then that's how the book ends, until I get a phone call a couple of months ago saying, just to let you know, ex-CEO of Disney wants to buy Portsmouth. So I had to go back, and then the book actually ends with the whole saga of how Michael Eisner, who is very famous in the US for the guy who kind of turned around and saved Disney, and many sports franchises like the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, how he came in and effectively has persuaded the fans to sell him the club. So now it's in the process of going through, and Michael Eisner will be the sole owner of Portsmouth FC. And what had been a kind of very uplifting end to the book, I thought, is now a little bit more tainted, because of everything all the fans told me. We've got our club back, it's ours now. As soon as somebody came in with money promising a return to the big time, that was all forgotten. And so they voted overwhelmingly to allow the club to be sold to Michael. Now, Michael Eisner is a very reputable businessman, did great work with Disney, but again, all the things that people said they didn't want, he kind of represented, and so it showed me ultimately that fans really want their clubs back, but they also want success, and they will change their opinions quite readily if it is on the table and it's available. So it kind of the book was going to finish in one way, and now it's changed, it's finished in a completely different way.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible, turnaround, but it's almost more fitting that way, or more appropriate.
Yeah, it is. And this is a theme that I got throughout the book. I mean, the chapter on China, which goes to China, but also deals with purchase of ADO Den Haag. These are fearsome fans who once burnt their own stadium down in 1982 because they're so angry with the team's performance. Renowned as the hardest football hooligans in the world. And this Chinese owner comes in, and at first they're a bit dubious, but then they go, "We're gonna beat Ajax. We're gonna be in the Champions League." And for them, it's all about trying to beat Ajax because they've been in their shadow for their entire lives. And the way that they were willing to allow this guy who owned the club, Wang Kui, who just basically didn't turn up, didn't pay his bills, wages went unpaid, it looked like the club was going to go bankrupt at some point. the willingness to bend over backwards to give this guy another chance, just for the chance of overtaking Ajax, for me was eye-opening. So it is a thread that goes throughout. It's just when I saw Portsmouth, that very sunny summer's day last season, last game of the season, they finished 6th in the table, I think, and they're going to go to the playoffs. It was so optimistic. And then, maybe Portsmouth, it will work out okay. It was just, I felt that Portsmouth had to work to prove to other clubs that you could have a fan ownership. And, it was just the first opportunity they got to end fan ownership, they ended it, and it might work out okay. I just, like you said, I think it is probably a more realistic fitting end, but I'm an optimist and a bit of a corny bastard sometimes, and I quite like a happy ending.
Yeah, I mean, don't we all? So I have a couple questions about, most of us don't get to go to these places like the UAE or Malaysia, Thailand. I've been to Thailand, and Bangladesh. The Prem is broadcast in, hundreds of, or like over 190 places in the world. Do you feel that, and same goes with Champions League and the other European leagues.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the far-flung corners, that these leagues are hurting the game in these far-flung corners of the world by killing the local leagues or the local teams? Or do you feel that it's helping people connect with the game even more?
I think there's a really big issue about this, about European football in particular, but in particular the Champions League and the Premier League. To a lesser extent, La Liga. Really, that's only just about, for many people around the world, El Clasico, or the big games there. But really, the issue is that the football that we export, which there is a kind of, I feel a kind of pride when I see, in the most far-flung corner, there's an Arsenal bar. I'm not an Arsenal fan, but it's my country, it's my culture, and this has been one of the most successful forms of cultural colonialism that's ever happened.
It's like like Hollywood exporting, American stuff. It's kind of, England's version of Hollywood.
Yeah, it's or like England's version of Hollywood, I think, is the Beatles, which is like or Depeche Mode. You go anywhere, people love the Beatles and they love Depeche Mode, which is, I don't know why Depeche Mode, but they're very popular everywhere you go. But you could go to, I remember going to a nightclub during the World Cup in Rio, and there was a room in this nightclub that only played Beatles songs. And that's the kind of the soft power that Britain has kind of enjoyed in the world. Part of it is the cultural aspect of it, and football is a really important part of it. But there is no doubt that it is crowding out the local leagues, both in terms of the ability to get crowds at the games, to leverage that up to television deals and commercial deals, and being able to really compete. It's a massive problem. So, and the other issue is that you then have the kind of premiertization of these leagues. So they want to call themselves Premier League. They see the model. They want to base the teams on exactly the same kind of names in a lot of cases. And one of the things when I went to China was that what we're seeing is, let's say start with Manchester City Group. The Manchester City Group has now an MLS team, a team in the A-League in Australia, has just bought a Uruguayan team, is involved in football teams in Malaysia, owns a big share of a J-League team. And this is what is the next step now. It's not enough that the Premier League or European leagues are playing in these, getting massive fans. They now want to kind of franchise teams and drop them into these leagues, and you'll see a Manchester City branded. Not necessarily Manchester City, but a similar badge, a similar colour. Look at how they've tried to make a kind of uniform aesthetic between the MLS A-League and the Premier League when it comes to Manchester City. Sky blue tops, the Etihad sponsorship. And when you speak to people in China, especially, they're like, what a waste it'll be. Rather than having an organic club that is plugged into its community, what you're going to have is a Manchester City Beijing, a Barcelona Beijing kind of dropped in there. And that's the next thing. So there is an issue about the cultural power of European football pushing out interest and the ability for leagues to really kind of function financially. but isn't even part of the problem compared to what is about to happen, which is, clubs becoming international groups that, will impose their aesthetic and their brand and their name onto emerging markets of football. And that's when we're really going to see something, I think, very troubling happen in football. It's already happening. But and then the other issue is the Champions League. In Britain, there's always been this talk of like the breakaway Super League, some kind of, like the top clubs will break. I mean, it's already happened, and this is going to increasingly happen with the kind of owners who are buying clubs. Stan Kroenke, the Glazers, all these guys have grown up in a cartel business that allows them to buy a franchise and never have to worry about promotion and relegation to destroy your bottom line. Look at the Dallas Cowboys. When was the last time Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl?
Oh, I mean, it's been since 96, something like that. It's been over 20 years.
It's been 20 years, and yet for Jerry Jones, it's the biggest earning franchise in American
Well, you're
sport.
too big to fail in the States.
Franchise.
It's too big to fail, because we don't have promotion or relegation, and with the big clubs in Europe, it seems like that's what you're implying as well.
Well, this is what's going to happen. So there is now a confluence of interest with Chinese, and you see this with the Chinese businesses that have come in and demanding changes to the Champions League, so that legacy clubs are given a heads up. So even if you've got to have AC Milan in there, even if they don't qualify. So giving places not based on merit, but now what kind of brand you are. Like one suggestion in the policy document that was leaked it was about a year ago now, was Twitter followers. Facebook followers, like how popular someone is. So what you've got, whether it's a US franchise kind of businessman or Chinese businesses or, people in England who've, now have made extremely valuable business out of football, they all want the same thing, which is a protected Champions League that has the biggest names in the world, and not kind of cluttered up with these kind of unfortunate lower league champions. They want legacy brands, and that is and everybody. And this is when I said that there are differences between billionaires around the world, but when it comes to business, they all converge, regardless of nationality. It's all about business, and this is what it's about. They're all converging in one place, which is to make the business or football work for them. And to do that, they want to have a closed shop business separate from the national leagues. And that's what's heading next. I mean, I do make the point that at some point, it's not going to be too far in the future. There will be an attempt to move clubs from their roots, and which sounds crazy when you look at Arsenal fans or West Ham fans or anyone like that, or Manchester United fans. You can't imagine that club not there in that city. But now, businesses, a few years ago, the balance of power within football finance changed, so that TV deals and commercial deals overtook gate receipts. And so gate receipts now aren't so important as they once were. I mean, one of the reasons why Arsenal built their big stadium was because you had to have a big stadium to compete with the other teams, and you just don't need that anymore. What you need now is a canny business guy or woman who can make commercial deals around the world, and people who are organising and negotiating these huge television contracts. And so when you think, okay, the price of tickets has gone up, local, like the traditional working class fans can't afford it anymore, more tourists are going, there's going to be a critical point where an owner is going to be tempted to say, okay, well, do you know what? We can really build this brand if we move this to another city that doesn't have a top football club. And that's when we know we've gone too far. That's when we know we can't go back.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned this to somebody the other day, and they're like, "This is ridiculous. It's not going to happen." Of course not. You can never move a club. It's, first they'll come for promotion and relegation, and then they're going to come for your city or your town. And that is, I think as night follows day, if you look at the way, again, people have made their business and run their franchises, run their clubs, run their businesses, it is about economic rationality, and that is the economic rational thing to do with football.
Yeah, I mean, look, American owners are many things, but when it comes to, greed and getting their money, they're incredibly smart. And there's a reason why they, shift cities all the time. It's because one city is willing to pay to have the team there with public dollars, and the other city isn't. And I think that is the great scandal.
That is a great scandal. I talk about this about the stadium. I'm sure you've read the work of Neil deMause, the guy who's done all this research on exactly this. Owners leveraging state subsidies between cities, between states, between counties almost, to get the best possible deals. And the richest men in the world, demanding hundreds of millions of pounds. Whilst I was in St. Louis, and there's a large part of this book is in St. Louis, I speak to activists who are fighting against the Rams being given money to build a new stadium, so they stayed in St. Louis. And they're like, our transit system is crumbling. The elevators in the maternity ward don't work. And yet you want to give hundreds of millions of pounds to Stan Kroenke to stay in St. Louis. Fuck off. That's what, she said that effectively,
yeah.
It's sickening, really, that happens. And and that, unfortunately, that model is what everybody agrees on. When you get to the billionaire class, that's what they want. And that's what I'm worried that if there's not proper governance put in place to stop it, that's what they're going to have.
We could talk about football stadiums till the sun sets here, because I think it's absolutely ridiculous. And but there is something I want to talk about, because I read your article, A Billion Reasons to Believe, which has been nominated for a business award, a football business writing award, and I thought was tremendous. And in the article, you have a quote which is something that a lot of people have thought before, which was from Mads Davidson, the Danish scout.
Yeah.
And he said, quote, "What Chinese football doesn't have is a Yao Ming. He's the biggest name in China, the first Chinese star in the NBA. He was the game changer. For me, that is what we need. We need a football Yao Ming." Do you think that statement is true? Does China need a Yao Ming for football to elevate itself to the next level? And then consequently, you've been to Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh. Do these other countries with these huge populations need one of these transcendent stars to elevate the game in those countries?
Well, the proof of it being when one of the first pictures in that piece is outside the stadium in Xi'an, where this World Cup qualifier was that I went to watch. Nobody's playing football. Everybody's playing basketball. As far as the eye can see, there are basketball courts. Now, there are cultural reasons as much as anything else, because football in big kind of overcrowded cities is very difficult to play because you don't get the space to play on big fields or even on five-a-side pitches. But the success and the kind of absolute dominance, really, of NBA in the past 10 years, almost purely down to the fact that they have produced a world-class basketball player. And then the NBA cleverly, I wrote a piece about this for CNN a few years ago, the NBA cleverly then invested in China whilst there was a huge football corruption scandal within China. It was called the Golden Whistle scandals. There's all sorts of clubs are involved in paying players and referees, and it kind of destroyed. They had to kind of cancel the league and build it up from scratch in China. So whilst people were completely, disillusioned with football, basketball took its place, and they had this world-class star. And I think it's exactly what Chinese football needs. It needs to prove that it can produce a player. And you can think of pure numbers. You've got, 1.3 billion people in China. There must be somebody out there who is a Messi, who is a Ronaldo, who's unconscionable. There isn't that kind of talented player out there. And that's why the investment, although there's a huge amount of investment going on in terms of external investment in European football, one of the big things, which is also in the article, was the huge building of academies and really trying to filter out these young talented players to try exactly to find that player that will transcend and achieve on the international stage in a way that will, not just be a motivation for other players, but will kind of prove that this way of doing business for the Chinese is successful. And I think that's ultimately what they want to find. I mean, they do want to qualify for a World Cup. They do want to host the World Cup, and they want to have a league that is comparable, not just to other leagues in Asia, but also to leagues in Europe and South America, and to compete on what, I mean, it's called the Club World Cup at the moment. It'll probably be called something else in a couple of years' time. You know, having Chinese teams appear in that. So yeah, I think it is really important. I think they, you know, you just think in the pure numbers terms, they will find it. But there is another issue here, which is this is President Xi's plan. You know, he's a football fan, and he's pushing this because he sees this as a huge growth market, not just in football, but in sports marketing, sports branding, every facet of the sports business. He sees China that could possibly be a world leader. But what happens when he leaves? I mean, in 8 years' time, he'll step down, a new leader comes in. They might not be involved in football, and therefore this all dies. And this is when I speak to Chinese people who see these cycles of investment, which is a little bit what happened with the kind of rise in football in China in the first place, around that 2002 World Cup, where they qualified for their first ever finals. The same thing happened. You know, a change of the guard, football wasn't a priority, and then it fell on the wayside, you know. And the worry is that when Xi Jinping leaves, somebody comes in who's not so into football, all these games will be lost. And so it's, you know, that's the asterisk next to all of this.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm very curious to see what happens. I mean, I know when I went to China, everyone was playing basketball. So we will see. I'm almost as curious as what happens in India, Thailand, Malaysia, because I mean the countries I just mentioned, when you add them up, they're 1.5 to 2 billion people as well. So I mean you have 2.5 to 3 billion people in some of these countries that are, as they get more developed, and we'll see how the shift in world football kind of changes.
Well, there is no doubt that the future of football is in Asia and is in Africa. I mean, something that's not being written about a lot. I mean, I don't really deal with Africa. I should have done. That was another thing I wish I'd done a little bit more on, was about the super rich in Africa. And there's plenty of examples of them owning football clubs for their own reasons. But there is, an economic, there's a booming middle class in Africa at the moment, and there is strong, there's obviously strong instability in certain flashpoint areas in Africa, but we're seeing, huge growth there. And when there's going to be greater growth, there'll be life expectancy will go up, health of people will go up. And, think about players coming through extremely poor, deprived environments, you can only help them when their kind of economic situation kind of improves. So you've got that, and also as customers of football, this is another thing which is going to improve in Africa and also in Asia. So the future of football is definitely in these two places. There are some cultural black spots: Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. Although they've tried with football in India. These are places where cricket is dominant, and it's proving extremely tough to shift from cricket to soccer. I don't know if you've ever watched a cricket game.
I have just the once, and that was more than enough.
Well, I'm a big fan of Test cricket, so I love a 5-day Test match. Which, if you sat the average American or average anybody in front of a 5-day Test match, they're like, what is this? This is like, it's longer than baseball. It's less interesting in terms of from an outside perspective. It's quintessentially English. It is a beautiful thing to watch. But the idea that there are three of the most populous countries on earth dominated by this quite cumbersome sport is really unbelievable. But they're finding it very hard to shift people's attentions away. That's not to say that the ISL has not been not had its success, but yeah, it's a hard nut to crack. But they'll eventually get to it.
Yeah, it just might take more time. But
yeah,
you mentioned earlier David Goldblatt, the author of The Ball Is Round, as someone that you admire, and you mentioned one or two other authors. Who are some other authors or writers that have inspired you, and who are some people that you read regularly?
Michael Lewis. Anything that I haven't read his new one actually, but Michael Lewis is somebody that you read, and that's how you write non-fiction. To me, that's how it's just brilliantly done. It's not overwritten. It's as much about structure as anything else, but a very human way of talking to people, and bringing out these stories, people that you might not. And this is something that I got particularly with John Ronson. I don't know if you've ever read any of John Ronson's
No.
books. He's written something about public shaming. Was the last book he wrote about how people who have made mistakes on the internet and have been publicly shamed, what he says about them and how it's ruined their lives, but also what he says about us in the internet age, with these pylons that people have. Because for us, it's just about retweeting or sending a comment. For them, their real life kind of reality to that destroys people's lives. But he wrote a book called Them, about it's called Them Travels with Extremists, where he travels and meets like people like David Icke, talking about the kind of shape-shifting and like New World Order fanatics in the US. He meets Alex Jones, the InfoWars guy, back before he was the most important person in American politics after Steve Bannon. He meets these people, and what was brilliant about him and also Michael Lewis is that they're very different writers. They're extremely non-judgmental, which sounds crazy for me to say that because I've just been talking about the Billionaires Club, which sounds incredibly judgmental about rich people. But it allows people to speak, and if they, the observation isn't to break somebody down. Usually, if they say something stupid, they're hoisted by their own petard. But what I love about what they do is that you walk away from that thinking this hasn't been a hit piece. You find something human in them, even when they have views that are abhorrent or something that you don't really agree with. And those were two writers that, when you can sympathise with somebody who on paper is a monster, who you think is a monster, or responsible for something that is kind of incredibly difficult for you to justify morally, but you can empathise with them. I think that is some of the finest writing and some of the finest journalism you could be involved in. So those two writers in particular. I mean, I go back to older writers as well a lot. I particularly like Kapuscinski. I know a lot of sports writers like Kapuscinski because he wrote the Soccer War, but if you read any of his other stuff, like Another Day of Life about the Angola War, he's another writer who, again, he has written briefly about football, but he's somebody whose style is very controversial because he does a kind of magical realism journalism thing. So is it journalism? Is it not? Is it fiction? Is it non-fiction? He kind of blurs the lines. But I love the way that he writes. And then I go back to even before, like George Orwell, not just his novels, but his non-fiction, which again was something that one of the most influential books was Homage to Catalonia. Going back and reading that again recently is still just as powerful. And, he gets shot in the neck going on fighting for the Republic. And you have to be somewhere to really find something out about something and put yourself in the middle of it. And that's what that book is a work of genius about.
What story are you most proud of? And why? Proud of writing, that is.
What story am I most proud of writing? There's probably. I always have a soft spot for. There are two New York Times stories I always think about. One of them being the story of the guy Ismail Marina, who's the pilot of the drone that was flown during the Albania-Serbia game. Tracking him down, speaking to him, and it was just the most crazy 10 days of my life, and it ended up with him getting arrested after firing a gun out of his car when he was kind drunk, which I didn't fit into the New York Times piece, but it happened a bit later. I wrote the New York Times piece, sent it off, and I found out he'd been arrested, and he was kind of under house arrest for about 4 months afterwards. And for a long while on national television, or like 2 days afterwards, my name kept on coming up, spelt in Albanian, saying that Amerikanski reporter James Montague, and then my name is like in Albanian, the Jers at X, which is quite cool. Was like somehow that I was like, he got arrested because I mentioned he had a gun for protection, and the police acted on that to arrest him. And then what actually happened was the police had been following him, and we'd been doing an interview in this place. He had a couple of drinks, and he to show off, he could have fired his gun out of the car as he was driving along. And then that's when they decided to arrest him. So they've been following him for weeks before the game, the return game against Serbia. And so that was just a crazy, crazy story. So that was another one for the New York Times about the Fratsia, which was a football club in Romania which had a one-handed goalkeeper and Romania's only black coach. And that was just, it was beautiful seeing them play. And this one-handed goalkeeper, Tudorel Mihaescu, I mean, it's really cool going back to Romania because he's kind of become a bit of a celebrity. And so at the club, which doesn't, unfortunately, it's folded now, but when I go back, they suddenly had fans. They had like a few hundred fans who turned up. They had like hipster fans who'd read the article, and it was really this. Because I travel around a lot, I'm not in the US, so I never see my work ever get published. You know, you kind of forget the effect it had. You know, that story, telling it kind of they're always on TV. He got invited to go to Colombia. Somebody paid to come and train at the club. He trained with Stour. He met his heroes, and it had like a real world effect on them and the players. You know, I was kind of really proud of that. But I mean, I think probably the best thing was a story for GQ about the Port Said massacre. I mean, I always say the best thing is a strange thing, but I think probably the most powerful thing, because I'd spent a lot of time with the ultras of Al Ahly, the Egypt's biggest club, from 2007 onwards, and spending time with them, watching them play a very important part in the revolution that toppled Hosni Mubarak, and then watching how that revolution fell to pieces and how it was kind of played out through them and through this massacre that took place at a football match where 73 fans were killed. A lot, you know, people involved, my friends, and it was a very emotional story for me personally. I'm still friends with a lot of them, but I wish it had ended differently. But I think that's probably the story that I would say. And it's weird saying proudest because it didn't work out, I think, as anyone would have hoped it worked out. But the story that I think was probably the best thing I've written, I think. But almost by luck, because if I hadn't met them in 2007 by just randomly turning up at Ahly Zamalek Cairo derby, I wouldn't have met any of them. But, I mean, that's the way things work, right? I mean, it's just life is predicated on luck in many cases.
I mean, well, it was a story that needed to be told. And, I mean, it was... as someone who read it, I can tell you that it was extremely powerful reading it, because you always think of ultras or just like even the most fanatic of teams not necessarily in the best light, and I mean really humanizes them, which is the sign of really any good journalism or writing. What is something... this is a question I ask all my guests. What is something that most people think is true that you think is wrong? Or something that you believe that most people would think is crazy, for that matter.
About football, about life?
Anything.
That their success is based purely on their own hard work and endeavour. That's not true. The world is a fundamentally unequal place. Some places are more unequal than others. But when you meet people and they say, "Yeah, I've got this," and look at how hard I've worked, they often have all these legs up in life that they completely ignore. So their success is their own, and disregard whether they have, you know, privilege, class privilege, male privilege. All these things are kind of forgotten, and success is often, you know, not down to people's own ingenious actions or hard work. It's often to do with how many steps up they are given above everybody else. And that, for me, is a truism of life. And it's a sad state of life, because ultimately, whilst you do get very good people doing good things, it also means that a lot of the world becomes a very mediocre place, whether it's in politics or media or business, you know. So that's the thing, is that people fool themselves into thinking that their success is real and based only on their endeavour, when It's not. And we're forgetting that. And because we're forgetting that, we're building economic and political systems that entrench the kind of inequality and inability for people who are born into poorer backgrounds to kind of excel and achieve their potential. Those are being dismantled because people think it's just about how hard you work and that's it. And the talent will out, and it doesn't. It doesn't.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received, and by whom?
I mean, the editor of 442 was particularly damning of me. But I mean, weirdly, I'm not sure it was the best, but it was. There's a journalist in the New Statesman who just told me, "Don't take your notepad out," and that got me thinking about this issue about how much, as a journalist, you impose yourself onto a situation, changes the situation around you. So I think that was the one thing that stayed with me, was that, you know, this thing about whether it's a camera or a notepad or, you know, for him it was just, if you bring out anything, then it's changed and it's irrelevant. I don't think that's the case. But it has changed the way that I have approached stories and recorded stories. And, you know, it's a very boring nuts and bolts journalistic thing, but, you know, I think by thinking about it and approaching it a certain way means you kind of get the kind of quotes that I get, or the kind of access that you get, because, you know, you've got to find that sweet spot between the two. So I think that's a pretty good piece of advice I got.
And what would you write as the first line of your career obituary?
Oh, Jesus. I don't know. I mean, it obviously wouldn't start at the beginning, because none of my books do. It's a strange thing in the middle. Maybe as he sat on the police cell, soaked in his own urine, his first book seemed very, very far away.
That is a great one. I mean, you can tell
one.
you're
I'll
a
keep
writer.
that in the back of my mind, you know.
Yeah. When you write your autobiography, that's what you can put.
I remember I've been very lucky. I've not had any terrible reviews of my books yet, but I think this probably will change with the next one. But there was one bad review for When Friday Comes, which was because the first edition is very much kind of first person. I was going through a divorce around the Middle East. Often, you know, drinking or canoodling or smoking hash with everybody that I met. And so it was almost like it was autobiographical. And there was one guy who wrote a review, I think it was on the When Saturday Comes bulletin board, as it was then called. And it was like, I'm not sure if this is the best book about football in the Middle East, but it's the best book written about James Montague. He didn't mean that in a positive way. He meant it like as it was a kind of navel-gazing piece of shit. So I feel like I might have already written all the book of my career. Potentially, the three books are, you know, the story of my travels from getting to the Middle East onwards. So I don't think it would be necessary to do that, but just repackage it maybe, or, you know, put a few more eyes in there. But
yeah. When you do the full on, you know, not just a couple years one. So now that you've, you know, finished writing the Billionaires book, and it's kind of gone through legal, and it's coming out in August, right?
August in the UK, I think in September in the US.
And so now that that's more or less done, what is your next project?
Well, I mean, this is what I'm thinking about at the moment. I mean, I've got a couple of stories I want. I'm currently writing for the Bleacher Report a lot. I still write for the Times and do BBC stuff as well, but doing a long form stories for the Bleacher Report. So last week I had a story out about Gaza, football in Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. And the next one I hope will be something about Iraq, and then hoping to go to North Korea in a few months. So I'm thinking maybe that, or I was hoping to write the story of Kosovan football, but that seems to be a bit obscure for people, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get it off the ground. But yeah, I think it's still. I mean, this is a great thing about being freelance. I mean, it's just you not just sit around thinking about things to do, but I mean, you know, I'm sitting here thinking about it, and ultimately, this is the benefit of being a freelancer. You have the freedom to do or not do what you like. I mean,
well, I mean, I can't wait to see what you end up choosing. All of those sound like really great options. I mean, I'm most curious by the North Korea book. I mean, I used to teach English in South Korea.
It'll be a long piece. It'll be a long form piece, that one.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go to North Korea and have it be anything short of a long piece because it's such a fascinating country. Actually, there's one of my favorite books. I'm blanking on the name of it now. I mean, I used to teach English in South Korea for 2 years, and my fiance, she turned me on to this book that she read that is just it's like a collection of like stories from North Korean refugees or like people that escaped to South Korea, and it's a great book.
I know exactly. I know exactly that book. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm blanking on it, but it's a classic. I mean, I can't wait to read that piece that you end up writing. So,
well, the next book I've got in front of me to read is North Korean Writers in Exile from Penn. You know, the writers NGO.
Yeah.
So reading a lot of dissident North Korean writing to get into the mood.
Ooh, well, I mean, have fun with that. I mean, that should be fascinating. Is there anything that you'd like to promote? I mean, we already talked about some of your books and some of your articles, but is there anything you'd like to promote, or how can people reach you?
I'll just Twitter, I guess. James Piotr, JamesPiotr, and I'm pretty open. You can find me anywhere, really.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure having you on my podcast. I know I took up a lot of your time, but you had just so many fantastic answers. I couldn't help but just ask question after question. It's been a real joy.
Actually, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me on.